March 1944. The South China Sea looks calm from above, an endless sheet of silver broken only by the shadows of merchant ships tracing thin lines across the horizon. But beneath that quiet surface, something else moves. Silent, patient, calculating. 190 feet below, inside a steel cylinder packed with sweat, oil fumes, and tension, an American submarine tracks its prey. The sonar pings echo softly through the hull. Men barely breathe as the captain whispers the order that will seal the fate of a nation dependent on every ton of fuel still afloat. Moments later, a torpedo slices into the water, then another. The crew waits in the dark. 40 seconds of absolute silence. And then, the ocean erupts. This is the story of how the South China Sea turned into a deadly funnel, and how American submarines, working with crude systems, unreliable torpedoes, and impossible odds, slowly closed Japan's last window to survival. When the United States entered the Pacific War, its submarine force carried a mission that seemed straightforward: destroy Japan's merchant fleet and isolate its empire. In theory, it was a classic maritime strategy. In practice, it was a logistical nightmare. Japan's industrial machine depended on imports for almost everything: oil from Borneo, rubber from Malaya, food from Southeast Asia, and iron ore from the Dutch East Indies. All of it moved across a vast maritime lifeline stretching through the South China Sea, a body of water that gradually became the single most important and vulnerable trade route of the Japanese Empire. American strategists understood the geography immediately. The region worked like a natural funnel. If submarines could dominate its narrow access points, they could starve Japan without ever approaching the home islands. But in 1942, the plan almost collapsed before it even started. U.S. torpedoes misfired, ran too deep, exploded prematurely, or didn't explode at all. Submarines were forced to strike targets again and again, exposing themselves to counterattacks while achieving almost nothing. Officers filed report after report, but bureaucrats insisted the torpedoes were fine. Japanese ships sailed on. Even so, submarine crews kept patrolling, pushing their boats to mechanical and psychological limits. They navigated through typhoons, dodged depth charges, and hunted in waters filled with enemy aircraft. By 1943, as American engineers finally resolved the torpedo crisis, the silent war began to shift. More aggressive tactics emerged. Better commanders took over. New technologies, radar, improved hydrophones, updated firing computers, changed the rhythm of combat. And then came the moment that turned the South China Sea into a trap: the collapse of Japanese convoy protection combined with the increasing concentration of American submarines in the region. What began as isolated attacks turned into a systematic strangulation. Every ship sunk meant less fuel, less steel, fewer aircraft, fewer tanks, less war. By late 1944, the Japanese Empire was still fighting, but it was bleeding out. To understand why the South China Sea became Japan's fatal bottleneck, we need to look at the map the way American naval planners saw it in 1942. The Japanese Empire stretched like a long, fragile arch: Sakhalin in the north, Borneo in the south, the Philippines in the center, and the home islands perched at the very top. Every vital resource had to travel along maritime corridors that narrowed as they approached Japan, forcing convoys into predictable routes. The Luzon Strait, the Formosa Strait, the waters west of Palawan, all of them were natural choke points. To the U.S. Navy, they were not just geographic features, they were pressure points. If submarines could dominate even 2 or 3 of these passages, Japan's industrial system would suffocate. But there was a problem. In 1942, the U.S. submarine force was not yet capable of closing those doors. Most crews were still learning the realities of long-range patrols. Mechanical failures were routine. Air conditioning was unreliable, meaning that inside a submarine operating near the equator, temperatures could reach 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Food spoiled. Mold grew on bulkheads. Men slept next to torpedoes because there was nowhere else to lie down. And even if they endured all that, their primary weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo, was betraying them. Conflict. The Mark 14 crisis. The Mark 14 had 3 different failure modes, each more infuriating than the last. It ran too deep, passing harmlessly under its target. Its magnetic detonator triggered prematurely, exploding before reaching the hull. Its contact detonator failed, meaning that even a perfect hit resulted in silence. Submarine commanders sent detailed reports describing these failures. Patrol logs recorded the same pattern over and over. 3 torpedoes fired, no explosions. Perfect solution, target escaped. Observed hit. No detonation. Washington refused to believe it. The Bureau of Ordnance insisted the torpedoes were flawless and that the commander's aim was at fault. It took nearly 2 years, 2 years of wasted opportunities, lost tonnage, and risked lives, before the truth was finally acknowledged. During this period, American submarines in the South China Sea prowled with weapons they couldn't trust. And yet, despite all this, they kept attacking. The crews adapted. They fired spreads of torpedoes to compensate for faulty detonators. They stalked convoys at night, surfaced, and used deck guns to sink ships when possible. Courage filled the gaps left by technology. By mid-1943, the crisis began to break. Field modifications, disabling the magnetic trigger, adjusting depth settings, reinforcing the firing pin, finally gave the Mark 14 the reliability it had always promised. Now, for the first time, American submarines could do what they were designed to do. And just in time. Because in the same year, the Japanese merchant fleet faced a disaster of its own. Japan's convoy problem. Before the war, Japan's navy didn't believe in heavy convoy protection. In their doctrine, the imperial fleet would win decisive battles, not escort cargo ships. Convoys were improvised, inconsistent, and poorly coordinated. Destroyers were desperately needed elsewhere. Air coverage was thin or non-existent. This left hundreds of merchant ships sailing almost unprotected across thousands of miles of open ocean, right into waters where American submarines were multiplying. In late 1943, the South China Sea began to change character. What had been a vast blue expanse transformed into a hunting ground. Submarines no longer searched blindly. They waited at choke points. They predicted convoy routes. They coordinated with each other, forming wolf packs of their own. The funnel was beginning to tighten. And Japan didn't yet know it. The technological turn. By early 1944, the U.S. submarine force was no longer the hesitant, under-equipped arm it had been at the start of the war. Piece by piece, the technical puzzle began to fall into place. Radar, once unreliable and primitive, evolved into a decisive advantage. The new SJ surface search radar allowed submarines to detect ships at night long before they themselves could be seen. For the first time, American boats could hunt with confidence in total darkness. Sonar improved as well. The latest hydrophones gave captains a sharper sense of where convoys were moving, how escorts reacted, and when depth charges were being prepared. Torpedo data computers, mechanical analog brains, became faster and more precise, allowing officers to calculate firing solutions under intense pressure. These upgrades didn't turn submarines into perfect weapons, but they erased the feeling of operating blind. And in submarine warfare, seeing first often meant surviving. The human factor. Commanders who defined the war. Technology alone didn't change the South China Sea. People did. By 1944, a new generation of submarine commanders had emerged. Men who understood the ocean's rhythms, who trusted their instincts, and who took calculated risks that earlier in the war would have been unthinkable. They learned to track convoys for hours, sometimes days, waiting for the perfect angle of attack. They coordinated with other submarines through coded messages, forming groups that mirrored the infamous German wolf packs but relied more on stealth and surgical timing. Skippers began pushing their boats into shallow waters where detection was far more likely, but where convoys had no room to maneuver. They surfaced aggressively at night, firing torpedoes at close range before diving to escape the inevitable counterattack. Some patrol logs describe men hearing depth charges detonate so close that cork insulation rained from the ceiling like snow. Yet they kept returning to the hunt. The shift in strategy, from targets of opportunity to systematic strangulation. At the start of the war, submarines attacked whatever they found. Any freighter was a valid target. But by 1944, American strategy had evolved. Intelligence reports identified specific convoy routes: oil tankers from Borneo, iron ore carriers to Tsingtao, troop transports moving through the Luzon Strait. Submarines were now assigned to intercept these flows, not just individual ships. The missions became more predictable, more focused, and vastly more destructive. Sink the oil first. Sink the tankers. Sink the ships carrying aviation fuel. Without fuel, the Japanese Navy couldn't sortie. Without raw materials, factories couldn't operate. Without food shipments, entire regions faced starvation. The submarine force wasn't just sinking ships. It was dismantling the empire's ability to wage war. The South China Sea turns hostile. By mid-1944, Japanese captains knew the sea had changed. Convoys began sailing with dread. They ran without lights. They zigzagged constantly. Escorts dropped depth charges at the slightest suspicion. But it wasn't enough. American submarines were everywhere, spread along the logical paths of Japan's shrinking lifelines. The once vast South China Sea was now a narrow corridor under constant threat. Every ship that entered risked not returning. And the crews aboard those submarines knew something else. The deeper the empire plunged into crisis, the more vital their mission became. The funnel was tightening. And the real killing grounds were still ahead. The year everything changed. By early 1944, Japan's merchant fleet was already under strain, but not yet broken. There were still ships to move, fuel to transport, and enough maritime traffic to maintain a semblance of normality. But that illusion collapsed in the months that followed. This was the year when the U.S. submarine force shifted from being a persistent threat to becoming a strategic weapon capable of reshaping the entire Pacific War. A key part of that transformation came from doctrine, specifically, the creation of coordinated attack groups, unofficially called killer groups. These were not random patrol zones. They were planned, layered ambushes. 3 submarines operating together. Each boat spaced miles apart. Each one acting as a sensor, a trap, and a hammer. When one submarine spotted a convoy, it didn't attack immediately. It shadowed the group and radioed the others. Within hours, the 3 boats converged, slipping into ideal positions like wolves circling a herd. The Japanese escorts never had enough sonar, never enough speed, never enough coordination to keep all 3 contacts at bay. One boat drew attention while the others slipped in through the darkness and fired. Convoys entered the South China Sea with 50 ships. Dozens of them never came out. The Luzon Strait, the doorway that could not be defended. Perhaps no region symbolized Japan's growing desperation more than the Luzon Strait. This channel between Taiwan and the Philippines became the primary artery of Japan's entire war economy. Oil from Borneo, rubber from Malaya, cargo from Singapore, all of it passed through this narrow corridor. The U.S. Navy understood this perfectly. By mid-1944, submarines patrolled the strait in layers. Some positioned themselves directly across the north-south routes. Others waited near the exits. Still others monitored radio signals to predict fresh convoys. Japanese merchant captains began calling the area a tomb. Many refused to sail it without religious blessings. Some simply didn't return. The collapse of Japanese escort capability. Japan responded with increasingly desperate measures. More destroyers were assigned to convoy duty, but they faced 2 critical problems. Fuel shortages. Every escort mission consumed fuel that Japan couldn't replace. By late 1944, some destroyers simply ran out of operational range. Poor training and outdated doctrine. Japanese sonar lagged behind American systems. Escort crews lacked experience. Coordination between ships was inconsistent. At night, confusion spread quickly. One wrong turn, one mistaken identity, and convoys split into disorganized fragments, each piece easier to destroy. American submarines exploited this relentlessly. When a convoy broke apart, it wasn't a problem, it was an opportunity. The wolves didn't just attack the herd. They hunted the stragglers, the wounded, the isolated, the human cost. Submarine patrol logs from 1944 reveal a side of the war rarely discussed. Yes, crews celebrated successful attacks. Yes, commanders felt satisfaction in crippling Japan's logistics. But the impact of what they were doing, starving an entire nation of fuel, food, and raw materials, was not lost on them. A few lines, handwritten in the margins of a patrol report, capture it clearly. These ships carry men who probably do not want to be here. But if they reach Japan, the war continues. If they don't, maybe it ends sooner. It was war stripped of illusions. War fought by men who understood its weight. The funnel begins to close. By late 1944, the South China Sea was no longer a contested zone. It was a killing ground. Convoys that once moved freely now traveled in fear. The sea lanes narrowed further. Escorts fell back. Radar-equipped submarines prowled night and day. Japan still had ships to send. But the ocean they entered was shrinking fast. The funnel was closing, and the final phase of the strangulation was about to begin. The breaking point. By late 1944, the Japanese merchant fleet was no longer shrinking, it was collapsing. Ships weren't just being sunk. They were disappearing faster than they could be replaced. Tankers, in particular, were becoming rare. The U.S. Navy understood this and shifted its focus toward the most valuable targets, anything carrying oil. Once oil stopped flowing, Japan's entire military machine would freeze in place. The South China Sea, with its predictable northbound tanker routes, became the center of gravity. Submarines began to treat every sighting of a tanker as a priority target. Many patrol reports from this period include the same blunt phrase: oil tanker. Intercept at all costs. It wasn't bravado. It was cold strategic logic. An aircraft carrier without fuel is just a floating platform. A battleship without fuel is useless steel. A destroyer without fuel cannot escort anything. In late 1944, American submarines hunted not only ships, but the very possibility of Japanese movement. The December disaster, Convoy High 81 and the downward spiral. One of the most revealing episodes took place in November and December of 1944. Japan assembled Convoy HI-81, a critical formation tasked with transporting troops and fuel from Singapore through the South China Sea. It included the escort carrier Shinyo, several destroyers, and multiple tankers. But the American submarine force was ready. USS Queenfish, USS Barb, and USS Pakuta formed a coordinated attack group waiting in the convoy's path. What followed was a textbook demonstration of everything the U.S. submariners had learned over 3 years of war. A shadow the convoy. A coordinate silently. A attack from multiple angles. A escape before escorts can regroup. The strikes came one after another. Torpedoes thundered beneath the waves. Tanker after tanker erupted into sheets of flame. When the Shinyo tried to counterattack, Queenfish launched a perfect spread that sent the carrier to the bottom. Japan had lost more than ships. It had lost its ability to protect what remained. The sense of inevitability. Merchant captains knew the truth. With each passing month, their odds of completing a voyage shrank. Radio messages became brief, panicked, filled with broken transmissions about torpedo wakes and sonar contacts closing in. Japan began rerouting convoys into longer, more desperate paths, hugging coastlines, weaving around islands, even sailing in daylight to avoid ambushes at night. But every adaptation opened new vulnerabilities. American submarines simply adjusted. New patrol grids were drawn. New ambush routes were established. The South China Sea, once a vast and open expanse, was now a maze with traps at every turn. The strategic consequence: a nation starves for fuel. By the end of 1944, the numbers told a story more devastating than any explosion. Over 50% of Japan's merchant fleet was gone. Oil imports had fallen by more than 90%. The Imperial Navy was immobilized. Aircraft remained grounded for lack of fuel. Factories slowed to a halt. And the submarines weren't done. American analysts understood that the South China Sea had become the empire's final artery. As long as submarines controlled it, Japan's collapse was only a matter of time. The sea turns into a graveyard. Patrol reports from this stage of the war read like a grim catalogue. Tanker sunk. Heavy black smoke. Freighter broke in half. No survivors sighted. Convoy scattered. Pursuing stragglers. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't cruelty. It was the grim rhythm of a war fought far from the headlines, beneath the surface, by men who rarely saw the faces of those they fought against. By early 1945, the South China Sea had stopped being a route. It had become a graveyard. And the funnel was now almost completely closed. The year of silence. By early 1945, the South China Sea no longer looked like a contested war zone. It looked empty. Vast stretches of water that once carried steady lines of merchant traffic were now eerily quiet. Submarine patrols that previously relied on radar and hydrophones to detect ships suddenly found themselves cruising through days, sometimes entire weeks, without seeing a single target. But this silence wasn't peace. It was the sound of a nation running out of ships. Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to a fraction of its former size. Many surviving vessels were damaged, limping from port to port, too slow to outrun a submarine and too fragile to risk open waters. Others were trapped in harbors for lack of fuel. Even the few tankers that remained could barely operate. They had no crude oil to carry. In patrol logs from early 1945, American submarine commanders began writing a new kind of entry. No traffic sighted. Enemy economy likely collapsed. The mission was changing. The war beneath the waves was entering its final phase, not a hunt for ships, but the confirmation of their absence. From aggression to interdiction. With fewer targets at sea, submarines shifted to a new priority, sealing off whatever arteries remained. They patrolled the entrances to the South China Sea, the Bashi Channel, the waters around Hainan, the approaches to the Gulf of Tonkin. Any ship that dared attempt the journey was met with torpedoes. Some crews described it as patrolling a dead ocean. But every day they remained on station mattered. Japan was now sending anything that could float, trawlers, old ferries, refitted fishing vessels, to carry essential goods. These shadow convoys sailed without escorts, without radio, without any hope of rescue. To submarine captains reading their scopes through the haze of dawn, it was clear that these were not military formations. They were signs of desperation. And yet, they were still part of the war effort. And so the attacks continued. The Imperial Navy fades out. As oil reserves dried up, the Imperial Japanese Navy began withdrawing ships from combat. Battleships like Yamato sat idle, no longer able to train or maneuver. Destroyers, once the backbone of convoy protection, were restricted to short-range missions, or permanently docked. Even aircraft operations suffered. Training flights were slashed. Pilots could no longer afford practice hours. Fuel was rationed to the point where entire air groups remained grounded for months. Japan's navy was still intact on paper, but on the ocean, it had become a ghost. And the submarines knew it. The tone of patrol reports changes. The submarine war in 1945 has a different emotional texture, quieter, heavier, more introspective. Without the constant tension of convoy battles, crews had more time to think. The adrenaline spikes were rarer, the long hours of patrolling more pronounced. Some officers wrote about missing the intensity of earlier years. Others admitted relief. Most simply recorded the reality they saw. Enemy merchant fleet destroyed. No major convoys remain. Japan likely cannot sustain industrial output. What had begun as a series of isolated tactical victories had grown into a complete strategic strangulation. The South China Sea becomes a symbol. By the spring of 1945, the South China Sea stood as proof of what sustained, targeted submarine warfare could achieve. It wasn't just a battlefield, it was a geographic verdict. The funnel was no longer closing. It was closed. The empire's lifelines had been severed. The sea lanes were empty. And for Japan, the consequences would soon become unavoidable. What remained now was the final descent. A nation running on fumes, an economy grinding to a halt, and the silent force beneath the waves preparing for the last chapter of the war. The statistical shock. By the middle of 1945, American analysts began compiling the full impact of the submarine campaign. What they found was staggering. All the destruction, all the strategic isolation of Japan, all the unraveling of its industrial system had been accomplished by a force that represented less than 2% of the U.S. Navy. Roughly 200 submarines, often operating alone or in small, coordinated groups, had succeeded in dismantling an entire empire's ability to move goods, fuel, and troops. While massive fleets of battleships and carriers fought headline battles, the quiet, hidden war beneath the waves had achieved something far more decisive. It cut the arteries that kept Japan alive. The economic freefall. By summer 1945, the numbers painted a picture of catastrophic collapse. Japan's oil imports were virtually zero. The Navy's operational fuel was down to single-digit percentages. Coal shipments had fallen so drastically that factories operated at minimal capacity. The merchant fleet, once spread across the Pacific, was reduced to a handful of fragile ships hiding in coastal waters. Transportation inside Japan itself slowed, then stalled. Without fuel, trains stopped. Without raw materials, factories went dark. Without ships, the empire could no longer feed its population. A modern industrial nation was being suffocated in slow motion. The final hunts. Submarine logs from 1945 contain an unusual mixture of routine professionalism and quiet reflection. Attacks continued, but they no longer felt like battles. Many crews described sinking freighters that barely moved, ships that had been patched repeatedly, vessels so old and damaged that they resembled relics more than assets. Some commanders refused to attack unescorted fishing vessels unless they carried strategic cargo. Others noted how strange it felt to destroy targets already worn down by starvation and neglect. But they all understood their role. Their mission wasn't to win individual engagements, it was to maintain the pressure that kept Japan's war machine paralyzed. And so the patrols continued. The torpedoes fired. The explosions echoed across empty seas. The human dimension of strangulation warfare. There's an honesty in the submarine records of this final stage. The crews knew the weight of what they were doing. They knew that Japan's shortages would hit civilians as well as soldiers. And though their mission was necessary, it carried a moral gravity that surfaces again and again in private diaries and recollections. One officer wrote, "We don't see the faces, but we feel the consequences." Another simply recorded, "If this ends the war sooner, it saves more lives than it takes." These were not men detached from their actions. They were men who saw the ocean swallow ship after ship, and understood that each one carried human beings, some willing, some not. The strategic reality. But the truth remained, without maritime supply lines, Japan could not continue the war. The submarine force finished what aircraft, fleets, and armies could not achieve alone. It isolated the home islands completely. The South China Sea, the empire's great artery, was gone. The routes from Singapore, Borneo, Indochina, and the Dutch East Indies had vanished into history. Japan was now fighting on an island fortress with no supplies to sustain it. And yet, there was still one final chapter left, one last effect of the submarine campaign that would shape how the Pacific War ended. That moment was approaching fast. The war closes in. By July 1945, Japan stood isolated, geographically, economically, and militarily. Cities burned from months of air raids, factories stood still, and what remained of the once mighty Imperial Navy lay rusting in harbors without fuel to move. But this collapse wasn't sudden. It was the result of 3 years of relentless pressure beneath the ocean's surface. The South China Sea, once the empire's lifeline, was now an empty expanse, a corridor where no merchant ship dared sail. American submarine captains noted the strange calm in their patrol reports. No traffic sighted. The sea is dead. This wasn't exaggeration. It was observation. Japan had lost not just ships, but the very idea of sustaining war. The last patrols. As summer unfolded, American submarines continued their missions out of duty, not expectation. They patrolled routes that no longer carried convoys, monitored straits where no tankers passed, and scanned horizons that remained blank day after day. Some boats completed entire patrols without firing a single torpedo. And yet, their presence mattered. They were the final lock on a door that Japan could no longer open. A few submarines took on new roles, rescuing downed pilots, tracking radio signals, or performing reconnaissance for upcoming operations. Others were ordered to stand by for a potential invasion of Japan, an operation that would have dwarfed the landings in Normandy. Had that invasion happened, submarines would have been the first line of defense, sealing off the home islands completely. But the war was about to end in an entirely different way. The sudden stop. In August 1945, 2 atomic bombs fell, first Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. And almost overnight, the war's tone changed. Submarines on patrol received fragmented messages. Cease offensive operations. Return to base. Hostilities suspended. The silent hunters surfaced into a world where the war had ended without a final battle at sea. Many crews felt an unexpected emotion, not relief, not triumph, but stillness. After years of tension, noise, and near-constant danger, the ocean felt impossibly quiet. The revelation after the surrender. Only after Japan surrendered did the full consequences of the submarine campaign become clear. American officers inspecting Japanese ports found wreckage everywhere, sunken tankers lying at anchor, freighters half-submerged, fuel drums sitting unused on cracked piers. Entire naval bases were paralyzed. Ships that had survived air raids and battles remained tied to docks, immobile from fuel starvation. Carriers couldn't launch planes. Destroyers couldn't leave harbor. Submarines sat rusted in rows, having never sailed in months. The destruction wasn't visible from the surface, but it had hollowed out the empire from the inside. One Japanese admiral admitted after the war. It was not the bombing alone. It was the loss of the sea. The human echo. The men who served in America's submarine force returned home without parades. Many civilians didn't understand what they had done or how decisive their role had been. Submarine operations were classified, their patrol reports sealed. The silent war stayed silent. But those who lived it carried the memories. The claustrophobic heat inside the hull, the metallic groan of deep dives, the thunder of depth charges, the long nights tracking shadows on a radar screen, the waiting, the patience, the calculation, every small decision building toward a much larger consequence. Their war had never been about spectacle. It had been about precision, about pressure, about closing the ocean one narrow passage at a time. The final image. When historians look at the Pacific War, they often focus on the great battles, the carriers, the island landings, the firebomb raids. But beneath those headlines lies a quieter truth. The South China Sea, once the empire's beating heart, became a steel trap. And it was in that trap, sealed by men working in darkness, that Japan's fate was ultimately decided. The funnel closed. The lifelines snapped. And the empire's war came to an end, not with a single battle, but with the patient, invisible work of submarines that few ever saw.